So, so as Ashley mentioned, we're going to try to touch on 5 key areas. They blend into each other, and so we're going to do this really as more of a fireside chat than any, kind of Q&A. So as we go through this, we'll have a few background slides that we'll use just to ground us in what we're talking about in the conversation, but really pop any questions in. Ashley's going to be monitoring those. We will save some time for questions. And then, I think as we go through this, I'm looking forward to it. So the first question that Ashley put out here was what regulators are saying about automation, integration, and risk management. And so one of the things that Kate and I were chatting about is, should we pop up the BSA rules, right, or rules and guidelines that are out there? And we thought, no, most of you on this call today are grounded in that, right? But let's talk a little bit about now, as things have moved forward, the technology aspect of it. One of the things, Kate, and I'm gonna put you on the spot here. One of the things that we always talk about when we start talking about technology and things that are new. This isn't new, really, right? The expectations.
Right. Yes. So, so basically, really over the past year or two, there's been such an influx of, new departments and new initiatives to focus on, the customer identification program, Section 326 CIP, and what are different ways to automate that process, because it was manual for quite a long time. And that rule's been out there since October of 2001. So a very long time. But with that, there have been vendors out there, since the enactment of that rule that have been able to automate the identity verification process through various tools such as, full name, address, date of birth, and whatnot. And so that was really, and that is what we really see now in the environment is how financial institutions have reacted to that rule. Where it's really changed has been, the new digital identity and AI and selfies and all of that good stuff. The way that I look at that is, and I've said this before in other panels, is, it's really what the management is like at the top and their openness with regards to embracing technology, right? So like a cell phone, you're going to have people that are standing outside a store to get the new iPhone. You're going to have a group of people who are just going to accept it because they've had their phone for years. And then there's going to be people who have their flip phone or don't even have a telephone, right? So there's all different stages of technology. And I really think it comes from the leadership at top with regards to embracing technology and where they are with that. That said, there is competition between the larger financial institutions to make that ease of use with regards to customer flexibility. Meaning that, who can take a selfie, who can do face recognition. I think the FinCEN guidance has always allowed us as vendors to be able to assist financial institutions with compliance, assist being the key word. And so with that, their new initiative that they have and the guidance to accept technology is out there. But I think from a regulator perspective, what I'm seeing, especially with regards to, AI and some other digital identity, is that it's always been that the regulators would put rules in place and the financial institutions would have to react. What I'm seeing now are the financial institutions are the ones who are kind of creating, AI and diving deep in, and the regulators are not really prepared for that yet. There was a conference last month where the regulators actually stressed concerns and warned against the overly rapid adoption of large and complex AI models, citing concerns about bias and inadequate regulation and oversight. So right now, I'm not sure that there is a true policy or transparency for AI. We also know that Microsoft cut the AI ethics unit, with a focus on responsible AI. So from a regulator perspective, I really think that, this rule is out there, and in order to get up to speed with what some of the technology focused financial institutions are doing, they're going to have to create rules and policies and figure out how to test. So I almost feel like the regulators are in a slow down mode with regards to how they feel about, the more robust technology that's out there.
Well, and I think that's where what we're talking about today, right? Kind of the key points on what we'll be discussing today. It's not that these rules and regs are new, right? It's just an acceleration on the digital front that's created, a lot more activity and, like face it, a lot more, as we call it, false positives in some instances, and just a whole nother level of how do you make sure that you can keep up and protect yourself from risk, right? Which is where let's look at technology on how we do that, right? Versus creating it as such a manual process. And look, I know most of us, right, have gone through a level of maturity to start to adopt new technologies, but now it's a matter of how do I maximize the opportunity I have, because technology is also moving extremely fast. As you mentioned, some AI, right, which we'll touch on a little bit later for sure, but it's really not the same rules apply, right? I mean, at the very core, you've got to know who you're doing business with, right? I mean, in the most simplest of terms, and you have to be able to understand how the technology supports you in making sure that you can do things faster, but you still have that, you've got to make sure that you understand what's happening, which I'm going to jump to automating the regulatory process, because we're going to kind of blend into all of these topics at once. So I promised I would try to keep up with the slides, but I think we'll probably move ahead of ourselves. So when we look at what technology is opening up, Kate, to your point, right, where do we see that that's going to be helpful, but also going back to tying everything back to rules and regs at the end of the day, right? When you've got to explain how you're managing this for your organization, that is something that you are going to have to do from a human perspective, and the technology is there to support you in that, but you still, right, whether you automate it or do it manually, there's always going to be that human intelligence required.
Definitely. I mean, I think, as we mentioned, with the technology and the fact that the rules are out there, right? The expectation was that, the final decision with regards to boarding a customer or continuing a relationship with a customer, is based on, what you see at that time, during onboarding. But that final decision will come from either the first level of defense, the second level of defense, a compliance officer, the KYC onboarding, whatever the internal process is. And, I don't know if we'll ever get to a place where AI will, make the decisions based on the components that the financial institutions put in place. But until then, there are several processes, and I think that's where the vendors come in, right? So you want to get the financial institutions as much information as they can to be able to easily make a decision. And I think that's where we're at from an automation perspective, right? So, do the initial screen, clear the false positives, present, the positives, and then take into account not just the vendor's matching threshold, but the client inputs, right? The financial inputs with regards to the customization features of the tool, with the goal being that they have everything they need on the face of alert to review it. And I think that is just with regards to clearing false positives, identifying true matches, investigations, right? So with a lot of the investigations for SARS or CTR, suspicious activity, screening is a component of that, not the entire investigation process, but a large component. So you want to be able to present all that, include that in your investigations. Same with analysis and software audits, right? You want to be able to have your permissions set up correctly. When I would be going through examinations, they were always testing permissions. Who has access to the tool? Who left the company and still showing his access? Or is there sharing going on? So there's a lot of pieces of, the automation process that still require human intelligence to be able to make sure that they can get through an internal audit exam, a regulator exam, managing the permissions of the access of the tool, and so on.
I think that's one of the things, right, that when we were prepping for the panel discussion, right, we probably could go on for days just chatting through all of these different topics, where one of the things that you were saying resonated with me was when we talk about these different pieces, right, that you can automate, like the KYC, CDD, right, you see on the left-hand side of the screen here, there's a great amount of technology today that supports automating some of these functions, right? And when you take your policy and say, okay, how do I automate this and implement it, et cetera, and then what you just went through from the human intelligence piece of it as well, I think it can go the other way also, right? One thing that you mentioned when you were looking at some new technology, right, was also to take a step back in your seat, right, and look at your policy and maybe not say, how does the technology 100% align to my policy, but does the technology allow me to find efficiencies in my policy? And then you go the other way and update the policy, right, based off of some of the benefits that you see from technology. I don't know, maybe you can share a little bit about that, right? The technology and data, let me put those two together because I think they go hand in hand.
Yeah, so the key for me when I was picking a software vendor was I would take out my global policy and take out all the rules, and the policy was reviewed by the regulator, so it was solid. And I would look for vendors that could actually support what my policy said, to your point, rather than the opposite. And so when I was ready to meet with vendors, I had a list of questions as far as, we look at this, I don't see that as an option, or, can you dive into the population sample? Because the goal will always be during, whether it's an internal audit or a regulatory exam, does your policy reflect what you're doing? And if it's not, you're going to have a problem. Specifically with one of the organizations I was with, I was looking at our PEP program, and we're having a lot of back and forth with regards to once a PEP, always a PEP. Is there an opportunity if a PEP hasn't been in office for 10 plus years? And so we actually found a data vendor that had very specific guidelines with regards to when someone is considered a former PEP and how they show that in what we do. And so we actually changed our policy to match the vendor because we felt that the research that was done allowed us to adopt that concept. And so that is something that I always recommend when I have clients coming to me about, tell me everything about, your data. I'll say, tell me everything about your policy. What are the key points that you have to go through? What are the nice to have items? What is something that, is in the near future? Because when a regulator comes in, the first thing they do is ask for your policy. And, some organizations, depending on the size, will have, the screening aspect of it, and the CIP aspect of it, baked into the global policy. Two of the institutions that I was at, we had a separate amendment for just specifically relating to our screening and CIP, and it matched the vendor completely. So we knew that was going to be great. So yes, thanks for bringing that up. That is definitely something that I think, as someone that's looking to purchase software, will be key.
So I'm going to jump where we've got the benefits of automation here, and I just want to spend a little bit of time here. Clearly, we're not going to go through all these stats, but we kind of jumped in. We kind of jumped ahead a little bit, right? What are the benefits to automation, and how should you take a look at it, etc. And I think if we look back at, what's accelerating this, right, which we talked about from the beginning, is just the nature of digital, right, the access that people have now to onboard themselves, you know, from a phone, right? I can say I probably onboarded myself to many more things in the last 6 months than I would have in the last 10 years, right? Where I certainly have to transact, or, you know, there's some money movement going around. As we look at what that creates and accelerates from a technology perspective, it really comes down to automating to create extra time in your day and being able to manage your risk appropriately at the same time with all of the added volume that's coming in, right? So if, you know, things like when you're looking at a vendor, or when you were looking at a specific vendor, right, in software, and looking at those key aspects, looking at your policy and saying, okay, I'm going to have an increase, you know, maybe you're launching a new product, right? And you're going to have an increase, and you know it's all coming through a digital channel. How do you make that more efficient? I think there's lots of ways, as you can see on the screen here, right? Like I said, we'd use it as background. When you're looking at your policy, Kate, and when you're thinking about what a regulator expectation is, right? I think it's one thing to say, oh, look, I can dial this up in this great new technology that I can automate this function, and it's going to give me, I'm going to pick on the first one, 80% false positives. It's one thing to do that, but then how do you look at it from a regulatory perspective? Because you still have to explain, where did the reduction come from and how was it there, right?
Correct. Yep. So one of the things that I recommend is, you know, to be frank, the entire reason that data providers and software providers exist is to assist institutions in compliance, right? Without that, they wouldn't exist. We would not be here. So really, it's super important to focus on making sure that as a vendor, you have the appropriate documentation to give to your clients. As we know, we're not sitting there with them when they're going through a regulatory exam, right? When they send the list, when they want to understand, you know, how the screening works. So you really need to make sure as a client financial institution that you're saying, okay, show me how it works. Provide me step-by-step documentation of how it works. I want to see how you came up with the matching threshold, because these folks are going to be in front of the regulators and they can't just say, oh, we use so-and-so. Now, for some of the larger name, you know, industry data providers and software providers, the regulators use them, right? So they are very familiar with them. You know, the regulators have a test, you know, document. Part of that is in the FFIEC manual. You know, and then they have their expectations that they add. So you're fortunate if you're a financial institution that the regulator uses. That said, you still have to be able to, the client still has to be able to explain how the software, how the tool got them to the final point. Showing them the resolution, you know, is all based on your policy, right? What does your policy say with regards to, if you get this, it's this? Clearing the resolution. A lot of companies have templates, like not a date of birth match, not a name match, not a country match. That kind of stuff is easy, but you really need to dive in and understand what the vendor is doing and how they're getting to that point, and that vendor has appropriate documents that the client can review and get them through an exam. So before the whole automation starts, right, when there's interest in automation, you know, that should really be the first thing that you're asking your vendor about. You know, I need to be able to get through a regulatory exam, so I need to understand the implicit factors of how it works. And, you know, and what are your sources, right? And is this public information? Where are you getting this information? Are the sources valid? And then once you get comfortable with the vendor, then it starts into, you know, the ease of use and the extra time and maybe reduction of resources. But that really is the first step to make sure that your vendor, industry-wide, industry known or not, that they have that for you.
So I'm going to jump ahead, and then I'm probably going to go back on these slides, because I think that that's important, right? And if I reflect back to our conversation right now, and then just looking at the slides, right, probably I would have put this ahead of the automation that you should look at for gaining, right? And what does that mean from a technology perspective? I think when I look at, the list that we walked through about what are some of the key functions that you can automate, what are some of the functions as, as institutions, a financial institution or other from their compliance program, as you're looking down that list, right? Automating the KYC, CDD, automating screening, automating transaction monitoring, automating the, the regulatory filing, all of those, I know technology and data opens it up to create some of that automation, right? And today that's happening a lot of times in multiple platforms or very manual process, right? So if we go to Kate, what you were saying, look, it all starts from my policy and then looking at how the vendor can support that policy. Then let's start to look at how we optimize and create that, the stats that we saw on the earlier page, right? I don't think there's a person on this call today that wouldn't love a big reduction in false positives, right? It's been the story that we've told for years. we need to figure out how we reduce false positives, right? I think I could probably go back to some of our panels, Kate, that we've done maybe 10 years ago, and that's a point. But now I think looking at it a little bit differently, what do you look at and how do you start to, find efficiencies in bringing a lot of those different platforms together today to get an integrated approach, but then make sure that you really are strong in aligning it back to the policies. Do you see, just given the roles that you sat in previously, the clients that you're working with today, do you see that thought process going into it saying, okay, I can automate things, yes. I also think I can consolidate from a vendor perspective, which look, absolutely, clearly that's, one of the things that we look at, frankly, in Alessa is how do you take disparate systems and bring them into one to get a holistic picture. But are you seeing that question asked as you go through, as your clients are going through the policy?
Yes, not consistently. What I see, how do I want to put this? What I see is there are clients that have the approach of they've gotten through a recent regulatory exam, so they don't want to make changes, right? Everything is good, and move forward. Automating is a huge cost, financially to pay for the services, but also for the resources. When you switch data providers, when you switch software providers, and they were successful and they worked, the question is always, do I want to dive into this automation process if what I do works today? And so, as a vendor, your goal is to show them how things can change. I think with regards to, the regulator expectation that we've really seen over the past 7 or 8 years is to reduce the platforms that are out there. They don't feel that if there's different lines of businesses and different operation groups using different platforms to achieve the same result, they don't feel that the customer, like the client, the financial institution's client, could be treated the same way if they're using a different data provider, if they're looking at one factor that a platform has but the other doesn't. So there's really been a push to reduce the number of platforms and go to a one-stop shop, and really try and have vendors have everything they need. That I've seen a ton, right? It's one of the first questions out of the bat. I need to do this, this, and that. Do you have a system that does that? If I say yes, they're excited. If I say, well, we can do everything but this, they're going to go off and try and find someone that can do that one-stop shop. Because if they're determined to do it, they need it to do it in a way that's going to be cost effective and that's going to be on one platform that can achieve all the results without having their resources log into all different systems to do that.
It's interesting, right? I think we see the you mentioned what regulators' expectation, right? Start to look at that and how do you pull away from multiple vendors, right? Because then you're running usually, one division is operating different than another. I would say that's probably not great, right? Yes, you want to have some different levels of risk, but certainly probably maximize the opportunity by having something that goes cross business lines, right? And I think that's clear from a regulatory perspective, the benefits of that, but also just from a cost perspective, right? I look ourselves, and I don't think we're unique with any organization out there, whether you're sitting on the client side or the vendor side, right? How are you making sure that you're managing, managing your business most efficiently? And multiple vendors is costly, right? So we're hearing a lot from our customers on, look, I've been given a directive, has nothing to do with regulatory, the regulators, right? I've been giving a directive that I need to cut our vendor costs by 25, 30%, right? And I
Yeah.
think this, if you can take a look at that in the same, I guess, in the same factor as looking for automation, right? It's all about how do you become much more efficient, much more effective, but you can also use that as well. One of the things, Kate, we were just talking about earlier before we jumped on this call was about expectations that I think everybody should have from their vendors as well, right? So when you look at, yes, or clients looking at vendors, when the regulators are saying, our expectation is you start looking at how do you consolidate vendors, right? What are you across your business lines, or your financial, your CFO telling you to cut costs, right, from a vendor perspective. I think it's very fair for clients to ask, show me what the ROI is going to look like. What really am I going to get? What is the true benefit, right? If I'm willing to hand you X dollars, you need to tell me what I'm going to gain on my side, right? Because it shouldn't just be a cost.
Definitely. And I think that is something that we're hearing as well. And, I think to your earlier point, once you get to that one platform or one-stop shop, or even a couple of platforms, it's easier from a cost perspective, from an administrative perspective, and then an operational perspective. There's no doubt about that. It's just the initial, work and resources behind looking at contract end dates. Is this a definite match? Is it more expensive? If so, why? And will my senior leaders and board be okay with the fact that it's a little more expensive because we're getting this? There's a lot of work within the first year and year and a half during that transition. And so you really need a vendor that is going to be with you through every step of the process. What I usually ask my clients after we've had an initial discovery call is, do you want to invite your IT folks? Because really what we're seeing today is, it used to be, a compliance person knows the compliance work, and the technology person knows technology, and there's really no overlap there. But what I've seen the past, 4 or 5 years, is that compliance folks are getting burst on technology. They know the questions to ask, or I'm being introduced to IT people who are talking about some of the compliance laws and regs. So there really is an overlap. And so if the compliance person doesn't have the knowledge of how their systems works, and the IT person doesn't have the knowledge of the laws and regs and what the compliance folks are trying to get through, I think it's integral to have them both on a call, because you don't want to, as a compliance person, you don't want to get 4 or 5 meetings in with the vendor and think you're good, and then you bring in the IT folks and they say, oh no, we can't do that, our system can't do that. And so I think it's really necessary for, one, the vendor to be with you from the get-go, 2, to set up internal meetings with the IT folks to kind of walk through what the software looks like and how it can, acclimate or collaborate with their software, whether it's another third-party vendor or an internal homegrown system. And then 3, bring everyone together and do a test, right? Do a pilot, and just make sure, before we spend this money, let's make sure that this is really giving us everything that we need. And so the vendor really needs to take the time, bring folks in. If someone has something they want met and I'm not familiar with it, I'll bring in my solutions consultants team, and they're the ones that have seen everything under the sun. And so they are aware of what can be done. So the vendor, obviously that is who you're depending on to help your bottom line, the ROI, and also the regulator exam. So they need to be extremely engaged during the process, especially during the reducing of multiple platforms.
So I want to make sure we kind of bring back a little bit. Let's going back to the title, I would say, of where we want to get, because I know we can go down several different paths, but really looking at what are the benefits, right? Show how do you use this automation, right? We just talked about the fact that there's a lot of vendors, where you can pull technology and data together to automate a lot of those functions. You should rely on going out to those vendors and making sure they can clearly show how they can support based off of your policy, and then add the efficiencies in, right? What is that ROI? Absolutely falling on the vendor. But then, Kate, functionally, right? Some of this technology, I would say, very different than what was available and out there, I'll say 10 years ago, right? Probably even 3 years ago, et cetera. What are you seeing that by automating this, by using some of the new technology, what's some of the added value that you're seeing, right? I've got clearly something on the screen right here. I've got our little example, right? Automation can quickly show you when there's been a risk change just by bringing it forward, right? Yesterday, this example says Susan was screened and onboarded. She was good May 1, 2021, right? No changes throughout. And then all of a sudden, May 1st, 2023, by using that technology and automation, that puts it right in front of your analyst, right? Puts it right in front of compliance. It says, trigger, hey, guess what? There's an issue, take a look at it. So what are you seeing this technology and automation has really brought for folks that, are sitting in the seat you used to sit in?
So it's really allowing the resource you have to focus on more pressing issues, right? For example, if you screen 1,000 names, and get through all the false positives, there could be one or two that you need to do a deep dive on that you don't know if you should board, and you need to bring it to your compliance officer. And maybe you need to file a SAR. Maybe you need to start putting a threshold on the transaction activity. It really allows, rather than going through queues and queues of alerts, to focus on the ones that are critical, that are really going to take some time to decide, what you want to do with regards to a financial institution. And that's really the biggest key. It's always going to, a year or so down the path, give you, administrative ease. Everything's on one contract. You're paying a flat fee to one vendor. You're reducing your head count. And all the things that you would assume come with automation. But the key I'm really seeing is the ability to focus on those higher risk clients, and making decisions with regards to promoting of what level is acceptable for accepting a higher risk client. If you're going to be monitoring them continuously, even if they're a PEP, they want to deposit a lot of money with you. Are you comfortable now that you have a vendor who is going to be checking it every single night, so you'll know the next day if something has popped up? So I'm really seeing it allows for the opportunity to, for a financial institution to promote their products to maybe different client bases because they're being monitored on a daily basis. And then also the ability to focus on higher risk clients with regards to SAR reporting, transaction reporting. It allows them to focus on those that are, critical.
I think that's one of the biggest things, right? Often, and look, we said it right. It's always one of those conversations about automation, I think the immediate reaction is, oh, somebody's going to automate, so there doesn't need to be, it's just a reduction in headcount. I think that, yes, that could be, right? That could be an outcome, but I think even bigger, it's more about really managing real risk, right? I think, not to dwell on our false positive conversation, but that's always been some of the pain, right? Is if I spend so much time on false positives, I'm not spending as much time or resources on what truly is risk to my organization, or how do I expand so that I can take on a little bit more risk. And I think that's what you were just outlining, right? That's really what automation is allowing us to do now.
Yeah, it's going to be the return on investment, right? And that's going to be helpful when you're approaching your senior leaders and management to say, okay, we're going to pay a little more, but the benefits of that, from a financial perspective, are going to be open in places where they weren't.
Yeah. So I will probably should have, we probably should have touched on AI back when we were talking about some of the automation. I will be the first one to say, look, I am not the expert, but I do think it's worth some of that conversation, right? As we look at the automation, what does that mean? And, what's it allowing organizations to do? I think there's a place for it. Look, I'll say I think there's a place for it because we're looking at it, right? And yes, we are a vendor. So we are looking at it. How can it help our clients become more efficient as well, but also not be a black box, right? So when we look at how do you use some of that automation that's available today, but then also, Kate, when we're looking at some of that new automation, right, and really looking at AI, how do you see that playing a role?
So I have completely different responses based on the seats that I sat in, right? So my officer, it's like, don't even bring it to me until everyone else has figured it out from a regulator perspective to a vendor perspective, and from, a vendor representative, it's like, look what we can do. This is amazing. And we can show you this and this. So I really think there's going to be a lot of different perspectives. One, just based on your role at your organization. Two, what's going on in the industry. Three, what the regulators are saying. And four, your own comfort level with, technology. As I mentioned earlier, there's definitely support from FinCEN, as we saw on the earlier slide, to use technology for automating laws and regs. But, I think right now, as we look at AI, it is such a hot topic. It is built to evolve. There needs to be an aspect of explainability there and, how it can be taken advantage of. I think, with the different factors that can be looked at, with regards to the components, an IP address, name and password, date of birth, social security number, aside from the IP address and everything, the name and address and password and date of birth and social has been collected. So that information is there. And I think there's a key to just say, with what we're using today, are you able to confirm what you need to confirm, that someone is who they say they are? I think the idea of AI is really for the customer experience, because from a regulator perspective, financial institutions have had this in place and it's been fine. But it's really, the customers that don't want to sit in a bank anymore to verify that information. It takes time when they could go on a screen and just do facial recognition. I think, responsible AI, which is going to be, AI from an ethical and legal point of view, who is going to determine what's ethical, right? We have the attorneys for a legal perspective, but you're still dealing with personal information, which has always been a concern from day one with the regulators. And now you're kind of opening it up to monitoring your clients and the computer that they're on and where they're sitting and what else they look at and what ads do they need. So I think the regulators are going to have to be the ones, at least for financial institutions, that are going to start setting some ground rules based on how quickly the AI is becoming a topic of conversation. And as I mentioned before, it's always been the regulators are the first to cite the rules and the financial institutions react. Right now, we have financial institutions that want to do more for their client, want to do exciting stuff, selfies, um, all that good stuff. In addition to, hey, let's look at the API, and if their address is showing that they're in India, then we know they're in India. Is there ways to manipulate that through VPN? There's a lot of different facets to AI that is still out there. I'm not sure if anybody knows how to get a handle on it. So I think, from a compliance perspective, it's like, do you want to see one of the big financial institutions try it first, see if they get away with it, see if there's no issues during a regular exam, and then let's get out there and compete? Or do you want to be that first one? And then from a vendor perspective, it's just, there's so much you can do with technology, and it's exciting, and we'd love people to adopt it. But we are, as I mentioned, we exist to allow our clients to get in compliance. And if it's not a rule yet, are we creating things just to sit on it? I don't know.
Yeah. I agree, right? It's fascinating. It's exciting. I've seen some folks do some really cool stuff with it that I think will absolutely benefit our industry, right? Make no mistake about it. I feel very confident there's going to be added value to our industry from a compliance perspective using AI. It's just, like you said, it's going to evolve, right? And by the very definition, it's going to evolve. I think it comes down to the very simplistic, right? Everything that we've gone through today, right? It's about how are we supporting a compliance industry? How are our friends sitting in the compliance hot seat, right? Making sure that they use technology to automate where they can automate. But at the end of the day, it's all about making sure that your institution understands where its risk lies. I mean, and it's a very simplistic format.
Agree. And you have the compliance folks and KYC folks that need to create a policy for AI and need to be transparent about how they're handling AI. I mean, how do you do that? How do you know that that the source you're getting isn't biased? There's just a ton of dependence on sources that may or may not be known. And so I think, we're kind of in this flux now where, the regulators had said, they're getting nervous about rapid adoption of AI models. And, I just think until a rule comes out and kind of lays the groundwork, and I know there's been rules out there and guidance on digital identity, but, digital identity and AI, they're the same, but they're very, very different with regards to having, human intervention versus everything done by a computer. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes. I don't think we're going to get, a formal opinion anytime soon until it's, until the regulators are in a place where they absolutely have to address it.
Yeah. And look, I think it does come back to, right, what I would tell everybody, no matter what seat I sat in, no matter what organization I worked with, right, from a compliance perspective, as you're evaluating new technologies and automation and data providers and all of that good stuff that's, added benefit to you sitting in that seat, you have every right to ask every vendor, right, exactly how do I explain X, Y, and Z? And I think that that's fair. And that's what I think we'll see as it does evolve. But make sure, I think as we talked a little bit earlier, right, what should you be asking different vendors when you're looking at that automation journey? Because at the end of the day, right, you own that responsibility. your vendor should be able to answer it.
Exactly. And that's what we said from the beginning, right? You need to find a vendor that has integrity. You need to look at their security and privacy documents, which I'm getting asked for much more than I ever have before. If they're independently tested, do they test their own document, their own process with regards to SLA? You want to get all that up front. And when I see a vendor who can do that, it's impressive. And when I have clients that want that information up front, before we get started, before we see the data, can you send me your independently test document, your security and privacy? And I always think, that person's got it together, because that's exactly what they should be doing before they even have a discovery call with a vendor. Let's make sure that you're set where this is. It also allows people to make clients to make a quick decision. If a vendor has information based on the cloud and they don't want to use the cloud, or they have a server sitting in Russia or Ireland, pull it wherever, maybe that isn't acceptable for their compliance and privacy program. So it's so important to kind of ask that stuff up front, and then have the conversations about, okay, now tell me about the product itself.
So we've got 9, by my count, we've got 9 minutes left, and I promised we'd open it up for questions, and Ashley's letting me know we have some questions. So I don't want to miss those for everybody that's on here. So Ashley, can I give it to you and we'll get to the Q&A?
Sure. So the first question is, how do you recommend clients address the black box concerns with software? This person is saying they've heard that with the OCC and NCUA regulators examining their clients and client banks and credit unions.
Holly, do you want to take that one from a software perspective?
Yep. I was just going to ask Ashley, can you repeat the question again? I got
Sure.
The black box is a hard pause for me. It makes me nervous. So repeat the question a little bit.
How do you recommend clients address the black box concerns with software?
So look, I'll say, kind of going back to what Kate and I were just talking about right throughout, is what expectations should you have, right, from any vendor that you are working with? And the expectation is there is explainability, right? At the end of the day, you have got to be able to explain why you've gained efficiency, why you've made a decision to use a specific software vendor, right? There's no way, and look, I'll let Kate reconfirm it because she sat in many of those seats personally, but you cannot go and the answer be, well, but it all happens on the back end and I don't know, right? That's not an acceptable answer. Or they've said that it's a black box, there's some beautiful magic that happens, right, behind the scenes that, we can't give you the detail for, you just kind of have to trust us. That's not acceptable, right? The fact is, yes, there's amazing automation. Yes, there's technology that can reduce your false positives. I'm going to apologize now because I'm going to make everybody dizzy, but I think that this is where this becomes really important, right? How did you, what happened that allowed you to use the automation to file a reg report within 5 minutes, decrease your 80%? It can't be a black box explanation. You need to feel comfortable and expect that any provider that you are using to create that automation in your processes can give you that explainability that you need from a regulatory perspective. I don't know, Kate, if you want to add anything there.
No, I mean, that's perfect. I think it's always been a concern for financial institutions, this inability to see, that deep learning system and how the decision is made, or, what's the transparency, and it's always been a concern with the inability to understand real time what's going on. And, that black box there's information for it and there's documentation. So if your vendor does not have that, then that's a problem. In my world today, we have documents that address, each part of that process. What is the matching algorithm? What factors are considered in the matching algorithm? What makes this a false positive? What makes this a true match? All the behind the scenes as far as how the customer's data is scrubbed against the watch list, all of that in intricate detail is available because, as I mentioned earlier, at the beginning of the discussion, is that, the vendor can't go in front of a regulator with you. So they need to provide you with the appropriate documentation so that representative from the organization can explain that. A lot of times it'll be a tech person. And, usually within the regulators, there are tech people as well. So you have to be able to explain it in a document like you're talking to a fifth grader. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. I mean it in the sense that you have different subject matter experts in the organization, whether it's compliance, internal audit, KYC, technology, transactions, sales. And so anybody needs to be able to take up that document and look at it and understand what the system is doing. So I think as long as your vendor has that information, then the black box is not a problem. It's not a negative thing. You have the information, you just have to understand it. And if you have questions about it, get your vendor on the phone and get them with an IT person or a solutions consultant that can walk them through it.
Great. We have a bit more time, so I'll ask another one. How important is it to have a global data solution to do background checks and due diligence? What are the benefits?
So, I think as we mentioned earlier, it's always great to have that one-stop shop from a global perspective. If you have a large organization and there's different lines of businesses, or, there's different affiliates that are, international versus domestic. I think the goal is to have, a vendor or a platform or a solution can handle everything. But with that, what you're going to find is sometimes you really do want to have more than one vendor. And that reason is because, either from a price perspective or because there's certain vendors that are known for a very specific process that they've spent a lot of time on. So they're really good at it, so there's different approaches that I think organizations will take. I think from a regulator expectation standpoint, the few platforms, the better. But I think you're going to be hard pressed to find a global end-to-end solution that is a subject matter expert in each part of the process. And I don't mean it's impossible. They're definitely out there. But I think, people need to do their due diligence and see, the subject matter experts behind each part of that process. And if it's there for some and not all of them, then maybe you do look to another solution to kind of support the global one.
Okay. And the two of you touched on this earlier, but maybe just reiterate a little bit. How do you ensure the vendor scans for changes on the horizons and incorporates those changes into their data and application?
I think that's as important as making sure as you're going through the due diligence cycles for any new vendor, right? Whether data or technology, consolidation of vendors. This isn't a moment in time, right? This entire conversation has been about the evolution of technology and what it should be providing to our compliance folks, right? That evolution, as we've seen it, accelerate, yes. And then just talking about AI right now, right? The acceleration is going to continue. Technology, look, we all know, right? There's some amazing things that can happen. There's amazing things that are happening, and our industries are changing. Regulation is changing. New regs that come out, you have to react quickly. We all know that. I think as much as we just mentioned going through the due diligence cycle to make sure, right, the explainability, how is it going to create that extra time in your day? It's not a moment in time for how can you help me today? It's also your expectation should be, what do you do as a vendor to make sure that I'm continually looking at, the criminals are getting more creative, right? They're also using enhanced technologies. How are you going to support me 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, right, down the line as things are progressing fast? I think there has to be a look forward, not just a point in time view. And that, again, right, Kate mentioned it earlier, and I'm going to steal her line and use it, right? We exist today to support our compliance clients. You have every right to make sure that part of that due diligence is how are you going to keep up with regulation change and the technology tomorrow. I don't know, Kate, if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, we're at time. The only thing I would say is, make sure that the vendors, that their primary product is on point before, some of the new enhancements that come out, right? Like you're going to see with all this AI and technology, vendors adding stuff just to be able to say they have it. But, you really want to make sure that the products that they do have and have had are really strong, and that anything new they're adding, that, to Holly's point, all the expectations are going to be met with regards to your expectations,
Great. So we're at the top of the hour. So with that, I would like to thank Holly and Catherine for today's presentation. You guys were great. And this concludes our webcast. Have a great day, everybody.